My grandfather called it the drum, because that was the shape of it. Squat, dented, about the size of a coffee tin, sitting on the third shelf of his workbench for as long as I could remember. He never said where he found it, only that it came up in his net once, off water he wouldn't name, back before I was born, and that in 40 years of picking at it in his off hours, it had never once so much as warmed to the touch. I grew up under that shelf, not literally. I grew up the way you grow up next to a man who fixes things for a living and for love, which is to say I learned to hold a soldering iron before I learned cursive. Grandpa Warren ran the marine radio shop off River Street, fixed outboard motors on the side, and kept the drum up on that shelf like a private joke between him and whoever built it. Every few years he'd take it down, clean the corrosion off its one exposed port, run a meter across it, get nothing, and put it back. He never called it a hobby, he called it unfinished business. I remember being 9, standing on an overturned paint bucket to reach the vise, watching him strip a wire down to bare copper with a patience I didn't understand yet, and wanted anyway. He never let me touch the drum itself, not out of secrecy. He just said some jobs you don't hand off before somebody's ready, and he never once told me I was. I used to think that meant never. I know better now. He died in March. I was 16, and it was my mother who cried, and my aunt who handled the funeral home, and it was me who ended up in his garage on a gray Saturday in April with a box of trash bags, because somebody had to clear it out, and I was the only one who knew where anything was. I got through the parts bins fast. The drum I left for last, the way you leave the hard drawer for last when you're packing a house, not because it's heavy, but because it's his. I took it down, turned it over in my hands. There was rust bloomed along one seam, and the single port on its underside had gone green with age, the kind of corrosion that eats contact before it eats metal. I don't know why I reached for the wire brush instead of the trash bag. I think it was just his workbench, doing what his workbench had always done to me, putting a tool in my hand before I'd decided on a plan. I cleaned the port the way he'd taught me. Slow, working the brush in one direction, blowing the grit clear, checking under the shop light after every pass. It took 20 minutes to get the green off down to bright metal. When I was done, I did what he always did last. Pressed my meter's leads to the contact, more out of habit than hope, the same test that had failed him 100 times. The needle didn't move, but the metal did. It was faint at first, a hairline along the seam where the housing met itself, glowing the pale gray-white of a coal about to catch. I sat very still and watched it deepen, watched the light climb the seam and branch, finding lines in the metal I would have sworn a second earlier weren't there. Not scratches, not tool marks, grooves, laid in on purpose, the kind of pattern that only shows itself once it's lit from underneath. I should have been afraid. I want to say I was. What I actually felt was closer to what you feel watching a kettle you'd given up on finally start to sing. A kind of held breath, waiting to see if it was really happening, or if you'd only wanted it enough to imagine it. Mrs. Talbot from next door came to the open garage door first, drawn by the light bleeding out into the driveway at 4 in the afternoon like it had no business doing. Then her husband, wiping his hands on a dish towel he must have carried straight from the sink. Then 2 boys from down the block on their bikes, who should have kept riding and didn't. Nobody said much. They stood in a loose line at the edge of the light with their mouths a little open, the way people stand at the edge of something they don't have a name for yet, and none of them came closer than the garage door, like the light itself had drawn a line they knew not to cross. I caught Mr. Talbot's face out of the corner of my eye, not scared, just wide open, the look of a man watching something he'd tell his grandkids about, and half doubt himself for the rest of his life. The seams kept spreading, gathering toward the center of the housing, toward my hand, until the whole drum sat lit from within like a lantern with the wick just caught. Then, at the top, where I'd have sworn there was nothing but scarred metal, a line of characters rose to the surface and held there, burning slow and steady, in no alphabet I knew, and every one of us in that garage somehow understood anyway. It didn't speak the way a person speaks. There was no mouth, no speaker I could find. The words simply arrived, low and even, the way a held note arrives in your chest before your ears catch up to it. I know your hands, Maker. I didn't answer. I don't think I could have. I stood there with the wire brush still loose in my other fist, and felt something settle into place that I hadn't known was unsettled, the way a door you've walked past 1,000 times finally swings shut on its own weight. It told me the rest slowly, in that same low arriving voice, and not much of it at once, that it had been built to wait, not for a soldier or a scholar or a king, but for a particular kind of patience, the kind that cleans corrosion off a dead contact one slow pass at a time, expecting nothing, because the work is the point and not the outcome. That it had failed to answer my grandfather 40 years running, not because he lacked the gift, but because the gift wasn't finished in him yet. It was still being taught, hand over hand, to someone smaller, standing at his elbow with a soldering iron she was too young to be trusted with. That the drum did not recognize blood. It recognized a way of touching things. I asked it eventually what it was for. It didn't answer that directly. It said only that a great many things sleep out past the edge of what any of us have charted, keyed not to strength or cleverness, but to the plain, unglamorous discipline of a hand that finishes what it starts. And that mine was the first in 4 decades of testing that it had found sufficient. It said my grandfather had come close more times than I knew, that the drum had stirred faintly under his hands at least twice, warmed by a fraction no meter of his could have caught, and settled back down each time because the work in him was still becoming what it would be. It said that failure, in his case, had only ever meant not yet. It said there would be more like it, elsewhere, waiting on hands like mine, and that I would know them when my hands knew them. Then the light banked low, settling back into the seams like a coal going to rest instead of out, and the garage went quiet enough that I could hear the boys' bikes ticking in the driveway. I still have the drum. It sits on the same shelf, third from the top in the same garage, because I didn't know where else a thing like that ought to live. I've learned since that it wakes fuller each time I work near it, like a muscle remembering itself in stages, and that it never once, in all the times it's spoken since, has called me anything but maker. I don't tell people what happened in that garage, not because I'm ashamed of it, and not because I think they'd call me a liar, though some would. I don't tell them because I've come to understand that the telling isn't the part that matters. What matters is that some nights I still go out to that garage after supper, pick up a brush or a soldering iron, and get to work on whatever's next. Not because I expect the light to answer back, though sometimes it does, but because that was the whole of what it was waiting on in the first place, not a chosen one. Just somebody willing to finish the job, one slow pass at a time, the way he taught me, for as long as it takes.